Aaron and Jeff, good afternoon.
Hello.
Noon or morning in my case.
There we go. So, welcome everybody to the 13th Hydrogen Energy Center webinar, covering topics of hydrogen, certainly. And today we are joined by esteemed industry experts and participants, Aaron Lang from Foley Hoag and Jeff St. John from Canary Media. And I'm very pleased to initiate this afternoon's and this morning's, for other coasters, webinar. A few housekeeping. We are recording this event, first of all, so you will be able to view it at a later time if you are interested. Second, the microphones are all on mute when you entered, and so we would appreciate if everybody could keep their microphones on mute. We've had issues in the past with various noises, phone calls, what have you, so it's very helpful for the community to keep that to a minimum, so we appreciate that. We also will be making use of the chat function for questions throughout the webinar. So feel free to posit any questions you might have as we move along today. Jeff and Aaron, is there anything else in the prelim that I may have missed?
That's good.
Okay. So today we're going to be covering the topic of the 45V hydrogen production tax credit, the proposed rules that the IRS has issued. Believe you me, it's not an easy read, as many participants are well aware. And I think the IRS is aware of that certainly as well. I didn't count the number of instances where the IRS has requested comment, but the entire 125-page document I reviewed was rife with opportunities to provide comment. And that's a material circumstance because there are a lot of elements of this proposed rule that are not defined as yet, and it will impact the amount of time it takes likely for the IRS to develop and promulgate their final rules. So it's a very challenging topic, as we discussed in preparations. We hope to cover all of it, but there is no real way that you can cover all of it in a single session. So we encourage each of you to take a look at the rules yourselves and dig into it. And we certainly are available to answer any questions, provide any assistance you might have going forward on this complex topic. The financial implications are extraordinary. The level of capital and expenditure that various people have estimated is just extraordinary associated with this. And indeed, the actual incentive, if you're able to capture the $3 per kilogram incentive, is quite material in many cases. So it is a very exciting prospect. But if we can first figure out what the map is and then figure out how to navigate it to that point of success, I think that's what we call a winning strategy. And so we'll see where and when that can take place, hopefully today, in some respect, in terms of everyone's understanding. The session is going to start with Aaron Lang from Foley Hoag. I've worked with Foley for several decades now. We helped form the Northeast Clean Energy Council some years ago, and I've always enjoyed a very strong relationship with Foley Hoag, so I'm very pleased that they're on the call. And certainly for years and years, I've read the prodigious number of words that have come out of Jeff St. John over many years, over many topics. And I'm just surprised in the last few weeks how many pieces have emerged on just the hydrogen topic alone. And so, Jeff, it really is remarkable how much keyboard time you must spend. And we all appreciate your prodigious insights and interviews and so on. So we're very happy to have you on the call as well. So we'll start with Aaron. I'll follow with some implications, and Jeff will provide some perceptions from some of the work he's been doing. And then we'll open it up to question and answer, and we consider the question and answer to be an important part of today's session as well. So with that, Aaron, if you'd like to take it away, that'd be super.
Sounds good. Let me just make sure that I can share my screen here. And it looks like you might have to give me permission to do so. Perfect. All right, I think folks can see that. So thanks everyone, and thanks Brad for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here because it has been a long time coming for these proposed regulations to issue, and they really are significant and a really important indicator of where we are headed with this tax credit particularly. Just a little bit of background about me. I am a partner at Foley Hoag. As Brad mentioned, I'm in the energy and climate group. I work specifically with renewable energy. I have done all sorts of work, primarily in siting and permitting large-scale renewable energy generators. So we work very closely in offshore wind and solar and battery energy storage. But increasingly, I've been working in the sustainable fuel space. And that started, several years ago, focusing primarily on more conventional regulatory programs in that space, the Renewable Fuel Standard, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And so when the IRA was enacted and these incentive programs were created for hydrogen, they drew a lot from those previous programs. And I began shifting over to seeing how these really important decarbonization programs would be implemented. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today is the proposed regulations that were issued by IRS for the hydrogen production tax credit. That's section 45V, which I'm sure you're all familiar with now. Let me see if I can. There we go. Before I jump into what the proposed regulations say, I want to just begin with a few basics about the tax credit. So most of this information comes directly from section 45V itself, the statute that creates these incentives. And a lot of this information is probably going to be a review for folks who are really plugged into what's going on with the Inflation Reduction Act. But the tax credit in section 45V is a 10-year production tax credit. It expires at the end of 2032. It applies to producers of clean hydrogen who make clean hydrogen results in greenhouse gas emissions of no more than 4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And that is the maximum level of emissions that can be associated with hydrogen. The hydrogen production tax credit sets up 4 tiers of credits, and you can see that on the table on the right. Also, this is a table that's been presented in a million different ways, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. But the idea is that the fewer kilograms of CO2 equivalent emitted during the process of producing hydrogen, the higher the production tax credit, starting at 60 cents and maxing out at $3 per kilogram of qualified clean hydrogen produced. There's a couple of additional caveats. It has to be produced in the United States, has to be produced for sale and use, and the process by which you produce it has to be verified by an unrelated third party, which the regulations address in great detail. Another important point is that the amounts you see on the right are multiplied by 5. They assume that the producer of hydrogen complies with the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements in the IRA, which I'm not going to dig into. But if you do not comply with those requirements, you can see that column on the right, you would divide it by 5, and that would be your per kilogram credit. The last thing I want to note is that this credit is technology neutral. Does not say one way, it does not prescribe a particular way to produce hydrogen, doesn't prescribe a particular feedstock. It only sets these life cycle emissions thresholds, and if hydrogen producers can meet them, then they may qualify for the credit. It doesn't tell you how to do it. So a bit more background before we jump into what the proposed regulations say. This is just something that I think is a little bit helpful for understanding the process. We are dealing with proposed rules, though a lot of times they've been referred to as guidance. Guidance in the world of administrative law can mean a whole number of things. It doesn't necessarily have to go through a comment period. It can be effective immediately when issued. That is not the case for these. These are very much proposed rules. And while they do set the course of where we may end up with the 45V tax credit, there is a period of time where the agency is going to take comment, going to consider those comments, and may possibly change the rules. So I've set out in brief the schedule here. February 26, 2024 is the big deadline to receive comments. And one point that I want to highlight is that, and I hear this a lot, is that do these agencies even consider the comments? And a couple of things. They are supposed to. They must consider the comments. Whether they accept the comments or whether they change the regulations in response to the comments, that's a different question. But if they don't receive a comment on a particular issue and nobody else files a comment on that issue, then that's the only guaranteed way for them not to address it. And so that's why I think in this particular case, when, as Brad mentioned, we're dealing with such a complicated set of rules, comments can be really important. Another couple of things to as a reminder, as I go through this, these are the proposed rules, the proposed framework. It's not effective until they're finalized. So it'd be a mistake to treat them that way, though it is very instructive. And then you might have heard about a lot of, ways that there could be legal challenges to these rules. Those legal challenges cannot begin until the final rules are issued. So I want to begin with what I think is like the keystone of this regulatory program, and that's the notion of life cycle emissions. As I mentioned in the previous slide, life cycle emissions are going to determine what tier of the tax credit you may be eligible for. And it's important to understand that this way of regulating is not necessarily unique to 45V. Life cycle emissions have been key to many regulatory programs in the past, and they carry with them a significant amount of regulatory baggage that is going to inform how IRS interprets these rules, how it administers these rules, and it's something to keep an eye on. The key component here is the GREET model, and that stands for, I've written it down so I didn't forget, Greenhouse Gases, Regulated Emissions, and Energy Use and Technologies model. And that is a model developed by the Department of Energy through Argonne National Laboratory. It's issued every year, and it is used for modeling life cycle emissions associated with production pathways. The model was initially developed to inform research and development. It's since been incorporated in a bunch of different ways in the renewable fuel standard and other places, and now it is key to the way that Section 45V operates. In fact, Section 45V specifically refers to the GREET model as the way to calculate emissions. And as you can see up here, it says that this has to be either the most recent model or a successor model. So what are we measuring with life cycle emissions? 45V provides an answer to that too. It's a phrase you might be familiar with, well to gate. It essentially means everything from the feedstock sourcing to the delivery of the feedstock, the production of the feedstock, the process to produce hydrogen, up until the point that hydrogen is produced. And that's where the life cycle emissions framework ends. And another important point, I mentioned regulatory baggage. The 45V specifically refers to parts of the Clean Air Act that also talk about life cycle emissions, and those are the parts of the Clean Air Act that apply to the renewable fuel standard. And I want to highlight this because I think it's really important. It'll be a theme as I go through all this stuff. The Renewable Fuel Standard is still very much an active program. California Low Carbon Fuel Standard as well. It's very possible, because they rely on these same underlying principles, that things that happen in the Renewable Fuel Standard could affect how things are interpreted in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it's a pretty good idea to keep in mind this world of life cycle emissions-based programs, because a lot of questions come up with, where is this coming from? And more often than not, the answer is it was determined, a couple of years ago in this other context. So it's important to remember. And the last thing I want to mention is something that I'm sure you will have seen, is the model that has been selected in the proposed regulations for assessing life cycle emissions. And that's this 45V H2 GREET. And IRS has said that this, in the proposed regulations, is the quote unquote most recent GREET model for purposes of applying the rules. I'm just going to call it GREET from now on because it's a mouthful to pronounce over and over again. So if I'm saying GREET, it's this special 45V H2 version. So let's talk about that model, because I think that is very important. And if there's one thing to take away from this presentation, I think it's this list. The 45V H2 GREET model implements certain pathways that you can produce hydrogen. And here are the 8 pathways that are listed. And this is really important. If you are not using a feedstock that is listed in one of these pathways, or the production process listed in one of these pathways, your method of producing hydrogen, you cannot use the GREET model to access the 45B credit. And so you'll see the number of feedstocks. There's fossil natural gas produced through steam methane reforming with carbon capture and storage, landfill gas feedstocks, coal, certain kinds of biomass, and then the last 2 are the electrolysis pathways. So instead of going through these here, I've decided to put together a little chart essentially showing what's in and what's out. So what's in? Blue hydrogen, and this is hydrogen that is being produced by natural gas and steam methane reforming with a carbon capture and sequestration option. Green hydrogen, that's low emitting electricity to run electrolysis of water to produce hydrogen. And then pink hydrogen, nuclear powered electrolysis of water. And then you'll see these few other landfill gas, RNG derived hydrogen, coal gasification, certain biomass gasification. I'm going to get into all of these in a much more detail to begin with, but the other column I think is just as important. The column could essentially be blank. It could just read everything else. But here are a few examples of things that are not addressed in this model. Pyrolysis of natural gas, plasma reforming. We did get your questions on this, and thanks very much for sending those in. But to the extent they were, what applies, what fits in this model and what doesn't, that second column gives some examples. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about biogas and RNG in just a second, but the real big distinction here is that certain landfill gas RNG pathways will be included in the GREET model, but all the rest, agricultural, wastewater treatment, those parts or those particular processes and feedstocks are not accounted for in the model. So what does this mean if you are excluded from the model? You will have to apply for a provisional emissions rate. And this is a secondary process, again, only applies if you're outside of the 8 pathways in the GREET model. And it is just an extra regulatory hoop that you will have to jump through to participate in the program. So what does it look like? Unfortunately, like many things, it's still a little bit unclear. The proposed regulations say that more information is forthcoming, but what we do know is this. First step, you are going to go to the Department of Energy, and you're going to request something called the lifecycle emissions value. And I imagine that will require filing some sort of petition and some sort of analysis of your feedstock, your process. And then Department of Energy is going to take that, do its own analysis most likely, and provide an emissions value along with their own analysis and their own results. So the next step then is to take both of those things, the emissions value and the analysis, and then provide that to IRS when petitioning for a provisional emissions rate. And that will be your emissions rate for non-GREET pathway hydrogen. And like I said, we don't know much about how this process is going to play out. The one thing we do know is that proposed regulations are suggesting that if you want to use this pathway, you're going to have to do a front-end engineering and design feed study or something similar so that you can show that you're at least far enough along in your development process so the Department of Energy can make a decision. I think the point of that is to avoid a situation where Department of Energy receives a flood of provisional emissions rate related applications for processes and projects that might not be further along in development. But again, we don't know much. It doesn't say much about why. And the proposed regulations themselves say the Department of Energy is going to provide further guidance on this by April 2024. So those are the two options. Let's talk a little bit more about the GREET model itself. I wanted to highlight some of the key life cycle emissions methods and assumptions that this model uses, and some of the ones that I think are going to receive the most attention in the comment letters and by the agency as we get further along in this process. The first one applies specifically, or most directly, I should say, to blue hydrogen pathways. If you're doing if you're relying on fossil natural gas with a carbon capture element, you're going to have to incorporate this background assumption of a 0.9% methane leakage rate that is incorporated into the model. So where does this number come from? It's a common question, I think. So the number is not in the proposed rules. It's in the instructions to this new GREET model that are on Department of Energy's website. And if you look closely at those instructions, the Department of Energy says two things. It refers to EPA's proposed methane regulations for oil and gas as potentially affecting this emissions rate. It also refers to this updated natural gas pathways and GREET 2022 publication by ANL in October 2022. And this goes back to something that I said at the beginning. This is something that was published sort of outside of the framework of Section 45B, but nonetheless is influencing how it's going to be applied. And so that's why it's important to keep in mind these other programs that are out there. But for right now, this is the emissions rate that is built into the model. It cannot be changed. In the proposed regulations, they say pretty clearly there are background assumptions in the model that cannot be altered, and they use this as an example. And I know Jeff's written about this number in particular. This is not a non-controversial number, and I know that others have suggested the number could be much higher. And I imagine that as the comments play out, we're going to hear a lot about alternative ways of measuring this. Carbon capture and sequestration also for blue hydrogen pathways, but could apply to any of the other 8 pathways. You'll remember those 8, a lot of them had potential carbon capture as an additional thing that could be added on in the model. But what I thought was pretty important was that the model, this is from the instructions again, assumes carbon capture with high rates of capture, and that's over 90%. And I wrote down here so I wouldn't forget what they say that how high levels of carbon capture are achieved. And they talk about using a combination of water gas shift reactors and solvent-based CO2 separation technologies. And those technologies include MDEA, Shell CANSOLV, and 2-stage Selexol, and that's particularly for coal and coal or biomass gasification. So those are sort of the underlying thoughts and technologies that are informing the instructions. To the extent those are relevant to the types of projects you're developing, it's something to keep an eye on. Landfill gas. So I think this is a pretty interesting aspect of these rules because the rules on the one hand include this model pathway for landfill gas and landfill gas derived renewable natural gas, or RNG. But at the end of the rules, they say that they aren't addressing RNG in this part of the proposal, and that other regulations are going to be coming out on that. And so I thought that was an interesting inconsistency, and I wanted to explore a little bit more about where the line is drawn. And this is what I think they are proposing. So a couple important things. I do think that landfill gas and landfill gas derived RNG pathways will be in this rule, with a couple of important assumptions. So first, the assumption when it comes to how emissions are assessed for landfill gas, they assume that in the alternative, if the biogas wasn't being used or the RNG wasn't being used for hydrogen, it would be flared. And so the emissions would essentially cancel out. This is something that comes from the RFS directly. This is how the renewable fuel standard treats landfill gas and other biogas-related pathways in its own assumptions. And I'm guessing that that sort of thinking carried over here. They also include an assumption for zero CO2 emissions during the reforming process. And then finally, what I think is one of the most important things to keep in mind for this specific pathway, they are contemplating direct connection, so direct use for the RNG to the hydrogen producer. And they're also contemplating that this is going to be the first productive use of that source. And the first productive use I'll get into in a little bit more detail, but it may limit which RNG sources you can use to produce hydrogen. I'll talk quickly about biomass gasification, which is another pathway. A couple of things about this. You can see the assumptions up here. I think the two most important things about this are that it's limited to 2 feedstocks, corn stover and forest logging residue with no significant market value. Rather than with the landfill gas pathways, which assume this flaring counterfactual that cancels out emissions, here the assumption is that the CO2 emissions from gasification are biogenic, meaning that they are coming from an organic source and assumed to be, when the CO2 is emitted during the process, to be taken up in the the natural regrowth process for these biomass sources. When the trees regrow and take CO2, it cancels out. That assumption, which is not without controversy, is carried over here for this specific pathway. But they do include emissions from certain other parts of feedstock, development and transportation, and increased use of fertilizer for the corn stover feedstock in particular. And now we can turn in many ways to what I think is one of the main events of the proposed regulations, and this is how we address electrolytic hydrogen under the rules. So we did get a lot of questions about this, and I'm glad that I took a closer look at the instructions for the model. But when we're talking about electrolytic hydrogen, now we're in the world of green hydrogen, and the question really is, how can we source electricity that complies with these rules to use it in electrolysis to produce hydrogen that meets that highest threshold, the $3 per kilogram tier? And the GREET model, when you are going to model your pathway, gives 2 options. And the first option is the specific source power. And this applies when you are claiming that you are sourcing your power from a solar farm, from a wind farm, from a low emitting electricity generating source to produce your hydrogen. How are you going to show that? You're going to show that by obtaining and retiring energy attribute certificates that, among other things, reflect these 3 pillars of clean hydrogen, which I'm sure is not a new concept to most folks on the call. And that is incrementality, temporal matching, and deliverability requirements. I'm going to do a very deep dive into all of this in just a few minutes, but this is really the overarching framework. What happens if you can't do that? Option 2, and that's relying on an emissions value that is assigned to the particular region you're in and the grid makeup in that region. And what's important here, and we did have some folks highlight this in the questions, is that the region is the NERC region. And what does that mean? And that means that the region is a little bit bigger than what you would see in the regionality or the deliverability requirements, which I'll show in a second. It extends, like in New England, where I am, up into Canada, and includes the grid mix associated with that region. And so that's just a little interesting discrepancy, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, but that is the default. And the issue, I think, is that unless you are operating in a region with extremely high amounts of renewable power, which we'll talk about in a second as well, the default is not going to be enough to show that you hit those low GHG emission thresholds. What's the point of all this? I should have started there. The point is that what the model is trying to get at is induced grid emissions. Is your hydrogen production process going to cause a need on the grid to generate more electricity? And where is that electricity coming from? And if you're inducing grid emissions, but it's being supplied by renewable power, you're not, or reducing grid demand, I should say, and it's being supplied by renewable power, then you're not inducing emissions. But if you're adding to the overall load on the grid, and that load includes a lot of fossil sources, then that could be adding emissions rather than taking away from them. So let me talk a little bit about energy attribute credits, or certificates, excuse me. So this is the contractual instrument that is going to be needed to demonstrate that your electrolytic hydrogen process meets the requirements of the 45B rules. And the rules give an example of what these instruments might look like. The big example is renewable energy certificates, so RECs. RECs are a way of attributing power to a particular renewable energy generator in states that have renewable portfolio standards, like my state, Massachusetts. I should have mentioned I'm coming to you from Boston. These can be used in our renewable portfolio standard to show that you have procured power from renewable generators. They also need to be managed by a qualified registry, and I've listed some of the registries here that are given as examples in the proposed regulations. One of the key things I wanted to mention about this is that the rules themselves do not necessarily distinguish between bundled versus unbundled renewable energy certificates. And what do I mean by that? Renewable energy certificates that are bundled, they typically include, they do include not only the credit, the REC itself, but the underlying power that's being generated, where the REC itself is just attribute credit. It doesn't include the power as well. The proposed rules do not distinguish between those two things. They don't prefer one over the other. Either are capable of being used. How does a renewable energy certificate, or an EAC in the language of the 45B credit, meet the requirements of 45B? It does so by meeting these three pillars of hydrogen that you've probably heard a lot about by now: incrementality, temporal matching, and deliverability. So incrementality, or additionality, as it's been referred to, just means that the electricity that you're sourcing, the renewable power that you're getting to produce hydrogen, is coming from a new or additional generation facility, something that's been recently built. Temporal matching is the notion that you are buying electricity that's being generated at the same time, or around the same time, or in some cases in the same year as the time that you're producing the hydrogen. So it's tying the timing of the electricity being generated by renewable sources to your hydrogen production facility. And deliverability, or regionality, that is the notion that you're sourcing your electricity from a generator, so a solar farm or a wind farm that's located in the same region where you're producing hydrogen, so where your facility is located. And that is the basics, but this is how the regulations, or the proposed regulations, suggest these requirements apply. So I've put on the left-hand side of here the proposed rules, and on the right-hand side, are the alternatives. And a big thing to remember here is that the left-hand side, those are the rules that are actually in the proposal. On the right-hand side, as Brad mentioned, these are places where the IRS would is asking for additional comments about how this would all work. It is not part of the proposed rule, and if it does, there's no guarantee that these alternatives will be put into place, but they have not. They're still asking a number of questions about how these would work in practice, and so I think it's really important. But what's the rule that they have proposed? So the general rule is that the low-emitting electricity source, the solar farm or the wind farm, comes online at no more than 36 months before your hydrogen production facility is placed into service. And they have one alternative way to do that they're proposing in the case of uprates. If you are sourcing from a solar farm or a wind farm that's adding turbines, adding solar panels, increasing capacity, and that increased capacity, you can show a link between that and the hydrogen production you're doing, and that the increased capacity occurred no more than 36 months before your facility was placed into service. And again, you can meet the incrementality requirement under these proposed rules. The alternatives, which I think are going to be very interesting. They have suggested a number of them. For existing fossil generating facilities, they're asking, can adding a carbon capture opponent to those facilities, if it's within 36 months of getting your hydrogen production facility online, can that count? They're not given an answer. Another one that I think is really interesting is this rule of avoided retirements. And this is going to become most important, I think, particularly in nuclear power plants. You're not going to find many situations where it's easy to time the building a new nuclear power plant with your new hydrogen production facility. And so that is a big barrier to the use of nuclear power under these rules. But what they have suggested is that if those plants are slated for retirement, and there's a way to show that retirement is avoided, and that's closely connected to your producing hydrogen, then that might be a way to meet the incrementality or additionality requirement. And finally, as we get going down here, they just get more and more confusing and difficult to apply. But this one this next one, I think about Vermont. So this is an alternative method where you would show that through modeling or through some other way that you're in an area where virtually all the power comes from low emitting sources. And that's why I think of Vermont, drawing hydropower from Canada, relying on renewable energy generation. And the point of that would be to show that your hydrogen production facility or electrolysis facility, when it's placed online and adding to the demand for electricity in that area, it's not going to increase emissions. The source, hopefully, you'll be able to show that the electricity you're sourcing is going to be extra low emitting electricity. The other part of this alternative is how they would address curtailments or periods of zero or negative pricing. So in places where extra renewable power is being generated, it's not otherwise going to be used, could go to hydrogen production. And finally, what I think is one of the more confusing parts of the rule that's difficult to understand is this 5% rule. So what are they talking about there? So where we were talking previously about areas that rely primarily on renewables or low emitting electricity sources to get their power, this would apply everywhere, but it would look at the renewable power being generated in those areas and say 5% of that, we're going to assume that would be curtailed or otherwise not used, and that 5% of it will be considered incremental power that hydrogen producers could theoretically use to meet the incrementality requirement, to get energy attribute credits, EACs, that are associated with that power, retire them, and then meet the requirement. The agency admits that all of this is very complicated and difficult to administer, and they have a number of questions for developers, for anyone really, about what they should do if they were to go down this route. But I think the most important thing for folks to keep in mind, especially the developers who may be considering these projects, is if you think you might be relying on some alternative method or want to rely on some alternative method for incrementality, one of the ones listed or one of the ones or some other method that might make sense, now is the time to tell the agency about it. And I think the important part is to explain how that method would not create additional grid emissions. So I'm going to jump then to temporal matching. So the rules are a little sparse on this point, but they set the following ground rules. Energy attribute certificates, as I mentioned, have to be timed such that the power that's generated, the power that they represent, is generated around the same time you're producing hydrogen. Agency is proposing a phase-in period for an annual matching requirement that lasts until the beginning of 2028. So you just have to show that the power that was produced in the same year that you produced hydrogen. This is the annual matching concept. Thereafter, all projects, they propose to shift to an hourly matching requirement where the hydrogen producer, you will need to demonstrate that the energy attribute credit, the credit you receive for the electricity, shows that that electricity was produced in the same hour as the hydrogen that your hydrogen production facility was operating. And so that ties it much more closely, of course, to the time in which electricity is generated. And what IRS thinks is that right now, the credit registries that I mentioned, those qualified registries, they, with a few limited exceptions, do not have the tracking systems in place to record whether, to follow whether hourly matching is being met. But by the time, this 2028 time, they think that that those registries will be able to meet this requirement and implement those tracking mechanisms. And one really interesting thing that I flagged in the rules is that there isn't one of the solutions to this, the hourly matching requirements. So the issue here is that if you're running your electrolysis machine and you are drawing power from a solar farm, you're only going to be getting renewable solar power when the sun is shining, so not at night. But what if you're also using an energy storage facility that's storing solar power while the sun is shining, and the same amount you'd need to continue running it after the sun goes down? Unfortunately, IRS has not addressed this possibility. They say that it is an issue that needs to be resolved. And it seems to me that they're doing is relying on the registries themselves to address the issue. So again, another place where the agency could benefit from some input, because it could be a solution. Deliverability, I'll just briefly touch on this. Remember I said that the electricity has to be generated in the same place where the hydrogen is being produced, in the same region. These are the regions that IRS is referring to. And these come from a Department of Energy transmission needs study. They track closely to the ISOs and RTOs. But you'll notice some things that, for instance, in New England, this is only the US, so generation in Canada doesn't count. And that the regions are pretty different than those NERC regions I mentioned earlier. So a few potential implications, and I think Jeff's going to cover some of this too, and probably in much more detail, but to note, these are pretty strict guardrails for avoiding induced grid emissions. And so that's really the point. The electrolytic hydrogen production, I think it's safe to say that it's going to be easier where there's more abundant renewable power. That might not be, that might be in Southwest or in Texas, places where there's a lot of sun and a lot of solar energy. For existing generators, where it's not easy to make new ones, nuclear power, hydropower, they're largely excluded. Unless there's some kind of avoided retirement or curtailment approach that's adopted. Like I said, it's not being proposed. It's just they're asking for more information about it. And so it's unclear what the final rules around that might be. Like I mentioned, electric power can't come from generators outside the United States, and the deliverability requirement doesn't take into account interregional transmission or the great need for it, frankly, to develop additional ways to get power across long distances. And the last one I think is kind of interesting because these three pillars apply to green hydrogen, electrolysis produced hydrogen. And because they could potentially be pretty strict and difficult to comply with, is that going to have the effect of pushing projects towards blue hydrogen, where you're more in control of your carbon capture equipment and could potentially, be able to comply a little bit easier? That might not be the case because it might be difficult to qualify it with carbon capture, but this is something that could happen. A few quick things before I finish up, because I know there's some questions about this. The proposed regulations do allow you to elect the Section 48 investment tax credit for your hydrogen production facility, but you cannot get the 45B production tax credit for it. You cannot have elected a 45Q carbon capture credit. And once you elect to do so, that election is irrevocable. But if you do elect it, then the percentages that apply to the hydrogen property, they're shown here. A couple of points about this. The election does not take you out of the requirement to comply with those life cycle emissions of the carbon intensity thresholds. Those still are part of the Section 48 credit. And another thing which I think is really important is that whereas the domestic content and energy community adders apply to like the solar farms, to wind farms, other energy properties, they, at least according to these proposed rules, do not apply to hydrogen property if you make the election. And the last thing I want to touch on is RNG and fugitive methane. I've mentioned this a little bit, but I think the main point I want to take is that the only RNG or biogas pathway that's available is RNG from landfills with a direct connection, and it's the first productive use. The rest of RNG projects are going to be subject to future regulations, and IRS is soliciting comments on 12 different topics that talk about how life cycle emissions should be accounted for when taking these things, when assessing those pathways. But they think that they're going to be logically consistent with the incrementality, temporal matching, and deliverability requirements we just talked about. There's likely to be a first productive use requirement. That's what the proposed regulations say. Of course, that hasn't been finalized just yet. And these are some examples of first productive uses. The one last thing that I forgot to put on this slide that I think is really important, and I read this, I think, last night, the provisional emissions rate alternative. So if you can't fit in those 8 pathways under the GREET model, you go to DOE to get a provisional emissions rate, see if you can qualify. That is not available for biogas projects that are not landfill gas. So if you're wastewater, agricultural biogas, other biogas sources, the idea is you have to wait for these new regulations to even apply for a provisional emissions rate. So something to keep in mind. And lastly, I won't stay on this for too long. The anti-abuse rule, which I think is really interesting, is essentially a rule that does not allow for like circular production of hydrogen in a wasteful manner. They give an example of hydrogen that's vented, flared, or used to produce more hydrogen, but the anti-abuse rule isn't limited to that, and it could be interpreted to apply to other creative, I guess is maybe the word, ways to be wasteful. And so I think this might cause some uncertainty. I think about financing and all the important stuff that goes on and the tax opinions that need to be issued to confirm that the credits will apply. If a practice appears to be wasteful, it just makes it more difficult to get somebody to sign off on an opinion that the IRS might not ding somebody later down the line. So I've been talking for quite a bit now. Just wanted to throw this up here. This is not necessarily just scratching the surface, maybe a little bit deeper than the surface, but quite a lot of detail. And there are definitely some other things in this rule that I didn't get to cover. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. There's my email. I got this little QR code from my marketing folks that links to my LinkedIn. So feel free to contact me there if that is easier. But really appreciate it. Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Jeff, And thanks everybody for listening in. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts in just a second. So thank you.
A super job, Aaron. Really fabulous to have you on the panel. I've been to a few of these already, and that was extremely well presented and concise, which is brilliant as well. So, Jeff, if you don't mind, I'll go next, and then we'll follow up. And I just have a few things I'd like to cover because I looked at some of the implications from an economic and process perspective. And there are some concerns here, and the number of ways you can produce hydrogen is ginormous, and that's going to be an issue for the DOE. And what we hope not to have happen is for the DOE to resolve or provide rulings on the alternative pathways, because the alternative fuel standard has a very slow process for getting alternative pathways approved. And I think with hydrogen, there are going to be a lot of alternative pathways proposed. So I hope they're ready for that. So I will share my screen. Okay. So I've been working in hydrogen with Valerity for 23 years, helping people understand markets and regulations and technologies and turn those into strategies both for businesses as well as public institutions, and been working not only in hydrogen but also in clean fuels. Last year did the hydrogen strategy for Puerto Rico, led a team on that effort. I've worked in the field of ammonia to understand the ammonia markets, and that's fascinating, as well as production pathways and economics. Did a project for a major wastewater treatment facility, 140 acres in Newark, New Jersey. And we looked at producing green methanol and RNG from their waste gas products in the wastewater treatment plant as a method to reduce their carbon emissions by a very large number as well. So just a broad set of activities in this space. The hubs have garnered a lot of attention, and I just wanted to put this out there. The 45V regulations, as Aaron mentioned, do not address the use of hydrogen other than saying you can't flare it. You know, you have to put it into use. And I know there are some questions about various uses, whether they're supported by this proposed regulation. And indeed, the IRS and DOE don't care what you use it for. This is a production-focused incentive. The second thing is that the hubs, were basically a mix of electrolysis and then natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. Not much in terms of the biomass area. And I did want to point out that that 3 of these hubs use nuclear. So nuclear is an important issue for these regulations. Hydro, for example, hydropower is a significant part of the Pacific Northwest hub, and they were rather chagrined at the 45V regulations and their potential impacts on what they're proposing to do there. And the other is, I think it's very interesting, but they certainly are a low emitting region, as Aaron had mentioned with respect to incrementality. The Pacific Northwest is fairly clean with their high penetration of hydropower, for example. So these regulations, whether the hubs would go forward with or without these regulations is an interesting question, but it definitely will have implications and cause some changes in some of the strategies going forward in these applications. The 45V requirements add complexity, they add time, they add cost, but make it absolutely clear that the value is significant of the incentive. So it is worth those changes. But there has to be time and attention paid. For example, the incrementality requirement has a huge impact because you have to time the construction of any new electricity sources for your electrolyzers coincident with your in-service date, or at least within 36 months. And that's a big change, certainly. For example, I've got some economics, but Plug Power has a fantastic hydropower agreement with the Economic Development Authority in New York. And we figured that their source of electricity might be around 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And the hydropower has extremely high capacity factor, which is very advantageous for keeping your capital used effectively. And they're not too pleased, certainly, with the proposed regulation that says the incentive doesn't apply to their plan. They may be doing an uprate in a hydro facility in Pennsylvania, so they may be able to use it there. So these are the kinds of implications which are certainly significant. The electric sourcing plan is very important. The EAC strategy is very important. The measurement and verification is embedded in the process. And certainly the linkage between completing a feed or similar type of analysis prior to going to the DOE to try to obtain your alternative provisional emissions rate, the sequencing becomes very important. And how does somebody know whether the investors are going to make a commitment in a project unless you can either get this incentive or not? In other words, does this incentive change the tide in terms of the attractiveness of your project? And if it does, you have to make a fair investment to reduce that risk at the outset and going forward. So these are very important elements in the timing of these projects. So I just thought I'd throw everybody an extremely busy chart. The next one I think is even busier, so bear with me on this one. And this is a preliminary, it's a comparative analysis. In other words, you look at everything on the same frame and then you change one or several variables in order to understand the implications of that change in a comparative manner. And we certainly couldn't analyze all the different configurations associated with producing hydrogen, but these are some of the ones that come to mind and address some of the questions that were asked as well. So let me start. The axes on this is certainly the x-axis are the different technologies and approaches in terms of the production methods for hydrogen. The horizontal, the axis that goes front to back is annual EACs and matching, hourly matching. So that's the difference there. And as you know, in the regulation, you can do the annual matching up until 2028, as I recall. And then after that, it's an hourly matching requirement. And then the vertical is the hydrogen cost to produce in dollars per kilogram. And there are lots of, I'm working on several projects which are much more complex analyses that look at depreciation, tax effect, operation and maintenance, and so on. So there are a lot of factors which influence these numbers. But this is an operating cost and a capital cost analysis on these various technologies, integrating certainly various capacity factors, regional effects, and so on. So let's start. We did Texas solar behind the meter. And why is behind the meter important? Because then next to it, we have Texas solar grid. Well, the difference there is if you're on the grid, you have to pay a transmission and distribution charge. If you're behind the meter, in other words, you're plugged into your own solar facility, you don't have to pay the T&D charge. And the difference there is the transmission and distribution cost. The temporal difference between the annual electricity sourcing and the hourly matching, that has to do with the capacity factor associated with your electrolysis equipment. These models are all assuming the same hydrogen quantity, which is 5 tons per day of hydrogen production. And what we can generally see is if you have a high capacity factor source of electricity, there's little difference between an annual EAC and an hourly matching EAC. The most extreme case of that is nuclear, because nuclear operates on average in the United States now something close to 92% capacity factor. But if you're in Maine, for example, and you have solar, your capacity factor is about, the modern panels are up about 18%. Texas, interestingly enough, has a capacity factor for solar of about 25%. And this is what we're seeing in Europe, for example, that Spain is very advantageous for solar. And a lot of this activity is in Spain because it's a fabulous resource in terms of the cost of the electricity and the capacity factors. So when we move to Maine for comparison, you can see compared to Texas, it's a fairly big jump in the cost of the hydrogen, and it's entirely due to the capacity factor difference as well. And I did want to mention that if you are doing hourly matching with an electrolyzer, you have to have a larger sized electrolyzer, so you have a penalty in terms of the capital carrying cost. And that's really what the hurt is with hourly matching, is that if you do hourly matching and it's direct one-to-one, you have to size your electrolyzer much larger, and you don't get as much runtime out of it as well. And I do want to point out that there is a single sentence in the 125 pages that applies to energy storage. And so that's an open item that will be addressed going forward. The wind is more favorable. We've got onshore and offshore wind. It has a better capacity factor, about 33% onshore. It's about 50% offshore. And that's an important difference. And then we can also see hydro has extremely good capacity factor. So the hourly matching doesn't provide any great, not a huge difference than just the annual in that particular case. And this gets to the nuclear basically, and the nuclear, the hydro and the nuclear in both of these cases were analyzed with and without the production tax credit. And the reason being is that right now, the existing hydro or existing nuclear basically can't participate in this program unless there's the 5% curtailment rule, or if they're slated for being shut down and somehow the use of hydrogen will keep them going, and the non-retirement option. But I did want to just show that if they're not able to obtain the production tax credit, the numbers really aren't too bad. Basically, you can see that hydro, for Plug Power in New York, without the incentive, isn't so great, but that's only compared to solar in Texas, which is not really in the competitive realm. nuclear, the advantage of nuclear is that the cost of nuclear has gone from about 4.5 cents in 2012 to something closer to 3 cents. Its production cost is very low, and this brings out another important factor, which is what's the best use of the electricity coming out of a nuclear facility or a hydro facility or any of these wind facilities. And if you're relying on a commercial enterprise that's going to build a wind facility, for example, are they going to choose to supply hydrogen production facility, or are they going to choose to go into the electric grid market? And it just depends what's their best use of that kilowatt hour. Where can they make the most money on that kilowatt hour? So that's a different factor. Nuclear has extremely high uptime capacity factor, and nuclear has a very low cost of production. It's very advantageous, even without the production tax credit. And the final slide, and I could have made this a lot simpler, but I just did want to get the numbers out. And we've seen this in the industry, which is the 45Q versus the 45V incentives for natural gas running through a steam methane reformer system. And in this analysis, the credit for the 45V came out to about 1.4 million, and the credit for the 45Q came out to about 1.6 million in this analysis at $85 a ton. And why is that? Okay, and this includes the 90% reduction factor in the carbon capture for the SMR. Very important number is the upstream number, the upstream losses of 0.9% of CH4. Another very important number, however, is what's called the global warming potential of methane emissions, which is a 28 factor. So basically, when you sum up the upstream losses and you sum up the 10% losses from the carbon capture, they're not equivalent, but they're getting close. In other words, the upstream factor is very significant in terms of where your starting point. And this is precisely why the DOE, they knew this is why they said you have to have, in their GREET model, it's like a minimum of 90% capture, because it's not going to get any incentive if it's below 90% capture. And you have to really move up to 95% or so to get better incentive. Here, you're only getting 75 cents a kilogram in terms of the emissions rate in this analysis. So we've seen this. The 45Q looks like it's generally more valuable unless you have some screaming great carbon capture approach as you go forward. And then you've seen this in Aaron's presentation, which is just basically the timeline, and the comments are due in 3 weeks with the DOE. That's the big number as we look forward. We will shift over to Jeff at this point, but finally, the hydrogen storage area for peak power, there's a big hole in this regulation for that, and hopefully we'll be able to address it. Curtailment, big hole in that regulation. And then finally, the storage of electricity is also an area which is just completely absent here, which is going to be very important. There's no question that people will include batteries to address the temporal considerations. And we did get questions on tax credit transferability. That's not an area of my expertise, and Aaron, maybe we can address that in the question section as we go forward. So Jeff, will turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Brad. And thanks, Aaron. And yeah, thanks all for joining us here. I'm going to try to do this real quick. And I have no charts. I was going to do a couple screen shares of some charts and stories I wrote, but I'll just drop the links in the chat. But let me introduce myself. I'm Jeff St. John. I'm Director of News and Special Projects at Canary Media. We're a nonprofit newsroom committed to providing incisive, timely information and insights on the climate crisis and the clean energy transition. And would definitely welcome you all to come visit us at www.canarymedia.com, where we're in the midst of, or just wrapping up, a week-long special project on the ins and outs of U.S. clean hydrogen policy, its promises and its pitfalls. And I'm really glad that you all invited me. Thanks, Brad, to share some of what I've been learning and what I've learned from my colleagues on this subject today. But yeah, we really started digging into the 45V tax credit in earnest in late 2022, around the time that, or after Jesse Jenkins and Wilson Ricks at Princeton University Zero Lab issued the first peer-reviewed research on the full emissions impact of grid-connected hydrogen production under different, clean electricity procurement rules, which was really kind of the launch of this whole concept of the three pillars of deliverability, temporal matching, and additionality or incrementality, as Treasury and DOE have called it, and that have kind of become the basis of the existing renewable hydrogen rules in the European Union and the proposed rules here in the US for 45V. And I don't want to belabor that point, but I bring it up because I had been writing about this stuff for years before this idea of temporal matching and locational deliverability of clean energy, but it was in the context of corporate energy procurement, Google and its 24/7 CFE concept, and Microsoft and other corporate buyers who are setting these aspirational goals to buy more clean energy that can somehow be shown to be matched up to the time that these companies are actually using it. And I got deep into the complexities of this and the alternative structures, such as emissionality or concentrating investments in areas where the grids are dirtier and stuff like that. But it was all relatively nebulous in that it was all voluntary. And so when 45V popped up, I was immediately struck by the fact that all of a sudden, here's this live case of where a government is going to actually kind of take these concepts and put them into action and requirements for a major kind of nascent industry to follow. And I do think it's really important to highlight this novel, groundbreaking aspect of what clean hydrogen developers are being asked to achieve here. I mean, these government activities have put clean hydrogen producers at the tip of the spear in this much broader set of activities amongst corporate clean energy buyers, investors, and developers, and aimed at redeveloping or redefining how we talk about, understand, measure, and invest according to these new realizations about the system level impact and value of clean electricity resources, storage resources, demand resources, that determine what we understand the value, the decarbonization value of these things are. And I'm sure if you guys have been tracking the debates going on this subject, whether it's kind of in this kind of nebulous kind of corporate accounting or in the kind of quiet yet kind of consequential work going on amongst stakeholders who are involved in redefining the terms for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 emissions. This is a very big deal that's going on at the World Resources Institute right now. This stuff is incredibly complicated, and it applies to a lot more than hydrogen. It applies to renewable energy. It applies to the debate over whether batteries are a green resource or not, depending on when they're charging and discharging their power, according to either economic or emissions accounting measures. And I'll tell you, one thing I've been schooled on over and over by experts in clean energy project development and financing in the course of reporting on clean hydrogen and the three pillars is complication and uncertainty does not help make projects happen. It's quite the opposite, in fact. So I am very curious to learn more about where hydrogen developers and investors are going to be able to move forward first in a kind of secure, mutually secure kind of understanding of where they're going to be able to get these tax credits. There's some really obvious ones. The three pillars will favor clean hydrogen production in some regions versus others, namely regions where you can build a lot more new green energy. And this is too obvious to belabor, really, but there is a useful chart from the Electric Power Research Institute's analysis of the impact on the 45V tax credit that kind of shows you where this stuff might happen. And maybe I'll just drop this one in here. There you go. Midwest wind, lots and lots of wind, runs a lot, more often than not, maybe. You can bundle your IRA tax incentives for, the clean energy you're building with 45V and get down to that kind of magic price point. Southwest solar, not as much, but maybe. Other regions, technologies, not looking so good. And I guess there are places like Texas where you kind of take this green and this yellow and you kind of add them together. But this is somewhat in conflict with the other U.S. clean hydrogen development policy, which is the hydrogen hubs funding and the $7 billion going there. And I think it's going to be very interesting. And Aaron talked about some of the challenges there. Obviously, Pacific Northwest and the Great Lakes have tons of clean power, but it's already there. It's not going to meet incrementality. I'm not sure how that's going to shake out. I guess you've got the Texas and the kind of Minnesota, North Dakota hubs where you do have access to that expanding clean power resource. But even California, California is trying to get the clean power for its decarbonization imperatives, and power is expensive out there and it's really hard to build stuff. And I mean, so many kind of, I don't want to say conflicting exactly, but so many things working simultaneously that need to come together. Let's just put it that way. I have seen some research that indicates that even the hubs that don't obviously match up with these 3-pillar imperatives can expect to be able to obtain the quantities of hourly matching new renewable energy to go after the highest tier of the 45 tax credits under the 3 pillars. And that's an interesting set of analysis. But as with all forecasts or models of the future, it assumes some things. It assumes that there's going to be ample transmission capacity to bring, say, wind power from Wyoming into the West Coast regions. It assumes that the interconnection backlogs that are currently making it very difficult to interconnect new renewable power are going to be resolved. And there's a huge difference between an academic study or an energy systems model that says something's theoretically possible and actually setting up a real world project with the operating parameters and power procurement provisions with which counterparties can agree. Yeah, we believe that this is going to work. We believe you're going to secure those credits during the hours at the volumes you projected, and here's the money to go build it. And here's a contract to go buy the hydrogen at the assumed price, the strike price. I really look forward to learning more about how folks are getting those deals done. And there's other kind of technical complexities that I am trying to learn more about. And the thing I'm about to talk to you about, I haven't written about yet because I don't know enough about it. But there's a lot of confusion I'm hearing from folks about how Treasury intends to manage what some people are describing to me as the missed hours issue. So you're not going to be able to get the clean energy at the levels of cleanliness that you need 24 hours a day. So you're going to have to ramp your electrolyzers up and down. But you can't really ramp electrolyzers up and down in perfect fidelity with the availability of clean energy. And I've been learning more recently about the safety issues of taking electrolyzers down below a certain kind of rate of production compared to their nameplate capacity, because you're going to have this buildup of explosive gases that need to be cleared out. And once again, electrolyzer folks, please email me. I'll drop my email at the end and tell me what I need to learn about this. So what do you do when, through no fault of your own, you're going to have to ramp down your hydrogen production, or if it's unsafe or unpractical to do so, keep running it during the hours when you have dirty power? And basically, the folks I've talked to say that there are two options: the averaging option and the cherry picking option. That's one person described it that way. And this person favored the cherry picking option. The way he said it, you allow producers to extract the hours that are supplied by dirty power and say they don't count. And so you could avoid ramping down unsafely, and other kind of operational, kind of suboptimal operational kind of stuff, by just running straight through. And then you just say, well, that hour of hydrogen, we don't get the tax credit for. But this expert also said that his reading of the 45E guidance indicates that Treasury intends instead to use a kind of an averaged emission intensity for every hour of production throughout the year. And this puts producers in a high-risk situation. You know, a few hours production at high emissions intensity could push an entire year's worth of production out of the top tier of the tax credit. And so I asked this person, why would Treasury choose this? And he said that basically he thinks it's because there are no real clear structures that would allow Treasury to account for the emissions intensity of production over time in ways that could handle the hour-by-hour exclusion method. And in the absence of those kind of clear delineated ways to do it, that they're worried about essentially gaming and lack of transparency and measurement and verification capacity. But then I asked, aren't hourly EACs supposed to solve this problem? Aren't they supposed to give you the data you need? And he said, well, maybe, but not really, not yet. There's so much of this not yet stuff that I think is really hanging over what's going to happen next. The same thing applies to using batteries, building enough on-site battery storage to store up the clean energy you get and then discharge it to run the electrolyzer during the dirtier hours. But I have learned in the course of reporting on hourly EACs that there's no clear way right now that you can prove that your battery, the juice coming out of your battery is clean, or to track the amount of juice coming out of your battery at any particular point in time with the amount of juice that was either clean or dirty that went into it at some time in the past. And I'll just drop another chart in here because I was talking to Energy Tag, which is kind of an international consortium that's working on kind of the first granular certificates to do this. And here's their chart of that storage temporal matching use case schematic. And you can see real quick that you're gonna have to measure the charge record, how clean the charge going in was. You're gonna have to measure the charge record, the charge going out. You're gonna have to account for the energy losses inherent in storing and then discharging energy. And you're gonna have to somehow track the time intervals. And I don't know what you do when you start trying to multiply this simple line chart with, and here's a unit of energy, here's a number of units of energy coming in over a certain number of hours, some of which were bearing this emissions intensity and some of which were bearing others. So once again, super complicated stuff. I think this all just gets back to the fact that we are asking, or the Treasury Department is asking green hydrogen producers to do something that has never been done before, at least not in a way that's been held to such a high standard of scrutiny and with such immediate and unavoidable financial consequences for the parties involved. As Aaron mentioned, hourly energy certificates exist and are in use today. MRETs, a big rec trader, is making them available, I think, in MISO and soon in SPP. I got to double check that. They might have them in PJM too. PJM reports hourly kind of emissions at the nodal level. Are these going to be the templates by which we see Treasury determine what EACs are useful and usable for 45V? How do you plug those into GREET exactly? I think these are all the questions that I have, and most of this talk has been me asking questions rather than giving anyone answers. But I think that's where I'm at right now. And I am, as you can probably tell, perhaps overly excited about trying to learn as much as I can about this, but I do really look forward to talking to you all and learning what's going on here, and how you guys are dealing with all this uncertainty and where you are seeing the various corporate and government and nonprofit and academic kind of players in this field providing more clarity where we might not have it today. And I'll just end by dropping into the chat my email address and a bunch of stories I've written on this subject before if you want to check them out, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
That's fantastic, Jeff. In the last few minutes that we have, I really appreciate your perspective because you spend your time covering much more territory than any of us do in a regular day. So that is definitely a value. I was wondering, Aaron, do you know whether the credits will be tradable? Is that an industry standard that will likely be followed here? And you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So before I answer this question, I should have said this caveat at the beginning. I'm not actually a tax attorney, and so some of these complex tax strategy questions are a bit lost on me. And you might be thinking, well, how is that possible? Because this is such a, this is a tax credit. This is really like an unprecedented marriage of environmental regulatory policy and tax policy, and I'm very much more on the regulatory environmental side and the energy side. Um, I so I believe the tax credits, they are tradable. The specific methods of doing that are a little bit beyond me. I am supported by a very competent and qualified team of tax attorneys who have been working on ITC related issues since the beginning and are really focused on this stuff. If you just drop a line, I can see what I can and cannot get from them on this issue. So sorry about that.
There's another good question, which is what happens after the credit expires? And my understanding is I think that if the company's in business and their cost basis is what it is, that there would definitely be an increase in the price of hydrogen at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that the expiration date isn't, I don't think necessarily the moment when the credit expires. It sort of depends on when you put your project in service. And then it's a 10-year period after that, as long as the project's placed in service before that 2032 expiration date. But credits can be renewed or revitalized. The flip side of this coin is that the goal of this credit, I think, is very much to jumpstart a nascent industry, as Jeff mentioned. And the goal could be that the credit, if the industry is running, may not be as necessary as it is now to get things going.
Yeah, and I would just drop this in real quick. Here's EPRI's chart of what happens, just in case anyone's wondering. That's the price of hydrogen under different pillars, but boom.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay. Are there any other questions that people have identified? I did see one that somebody building a solar facility to make hydrogen, they'll get incentive on the solar side, and they're wondering if that was a double claim with the hydrogen benefit. My understanding is it's separate. Is that, Aaron, your understanding?
That is my general understanding. So the big no stacking rules generally are no carbon capture 45Q credit with a 45B, and no 48 for a hydrogen production facility. That's the investment tax credit with a 45B or 45Q. But other than that, there are other credits, clean sustainable aviation fuel credit, and then starting in 2027, the clean fuels credit. There are not stacking prohibitions on those either. So I know a lot of folks are thinking of hydrogen as a feedstock for those clean fuels, and that's just another thing to consider. I did want to quickly address one question I saw about the book and claim on RNG. I would encourage folks to really closely read the GREET guidelines, because while I think those instructions for the 45H2 GREET talk about assumptions that can be put in place for book and claim, I'm not sure that they are actually allowing it right now. This is where there's a lot of confusion. And I think part of the reason they're asking for more comments to produce more regulations specifically focused on renewable natural gas is what to do about the book and claim and how these additionality, temporal matching, and deliverability apply to biogas. There's a lot of questions going on about biogas in general, and so I think they're taking extra time.
Super. unless you guys, if you see any other particular questions that you'd like to address, we could do one more. If not, we can call it an afternoon. Aaron, you all set?
Yeah, I think that looks good to me. I think somebody asked about the 0.9% methane rate and how that relates to the CI, but I think your presentation addressed that, Brad. Just something to factor in that can lower the CI value at something you have to take into account with your carbon capture equipment and the effectiveness of it.
Yes, it's not insubstantial if we could do another double negative. And Jeff, you all set today?
Yeah, I think so. I think we've answered, at least addressed all the questions, except for the ones that I don't know the answers to.
That's a problem.
Skirt those for today, along with the rest of the industry. Very exciting. Okay, well, everyone, let's keep the dialogue going. Feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to future sessions. And Aaron and Jeff, fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for jumping on today. So with that, we'll end this afternoon's webinar. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.